Well, let's talk about your brief first of all as Shadow Foreign Affairs. Big concerns over what's been happening in Hong Kong after battles between pro-democracy activists at the weekend and the police once again in Hong Kong after the plans for the Chinese authorities to impose a new security law. Lots of concern internationally, but realistically, what can the rest of the world do to stop China imposing this law?
Well, the Foreign Secretary made a good first step on Friday because he joined with his Canadian and Australian counterparts to issue a statement highlighting the importance of preventing the joint declaration which we signed, which protects the rights and freedoms of people in Hong Kong from being eroded by China. But the truth is that looking at the protests and the use of tear gas, pepper spray and water cannons against pro-democracy protesters in recent days, he's going to have to set out concrete measures that he wants the Hong Kong administration and the Chinese authorities to take in the next few weeks. The most important of those and most pressing is an independent judge-led inquiry into police brutality. Without that, there will be no way of calming these protests down. People must be held to account for what has happened. And the second very important thing is that what the protesters really want is democratic reform and universal suffrage. And without that, there's no long-term solution. So I think it's absolutely essential that the UK, with our special and long-standing relationship with the people of Hong Kong, stand up now and press for that to happen.
Well, again, perhaps we're sure of that when we sign that joint declaration and it goes to 2047, at which point the Chinese do take full control of the country. Realistically, if the Chinese roll the tanks in or they just impose this law, start arresting people, taking them back off to the mainland, which was the fear which started all the protests originally last year, there's nothing the British, Australians, New Zealanders, even the Americans can do. Realistically, we're not going to be sending the gunboats out to China at this time.
Well, that's exactly the situation we need to avoid. And yesterday, China's military commander announced that they were preparing to send as many as 10,000 troops to Hong Kong to implement this new national security legislation, which was the root cause of this wave of protests. We've got to avoid that situation. And that's one of the reasons why I've been pushing the government. They have been quite slow to come out and make a statement around this. I want the Foreign Secretary to come to the House of Commons on Tuesday and answer questions about this. There's a huge amount of concern about this, not just amongst Labour MPs, but amongst Tory MPs as well. We've seen with COVID-19 how important our international alliances are. Those alliances are based on the rule of law, on democracy and on human rights. And we cannot allow the Chinese government at this very critical moment to start eroding those rights and protections in Hong Kong. We've got to stand up for those values across the world.
Let's also talk about obviously what's been going on here in this country. We're still dealing with the pandemic. Many think actually that China are taking advantage of the pandemic, which they helped cause, to take advantage of the situation in Hong Kong and elsewhere in the South China Sea as well. But we are battling with this pandemic. Do you think that Dominic Cummings is going to still be in his job this time next week?
I have no idea, and I think that's largely up to the Prime Minister. Dominic Cummings has said he's not going to resign. The Prime Minister said that he's not going to sack him because he believes that he didn't break the rules that he himself helped to write. It's become increasingly clear over the weekend that there are real inconsistencies in that. For some reason, Dominic Cummings seems to believe that he's a unique case. And while I've got enormous sympathy with a family where one or both parents were suffering from COVID and who have a young child, that is not a unique case. I've got so many constituents who've had to deal with the same thing, including frontline workers who've really, really struggled over the last few weeks. And I think it's becoming increasingly unsustainable for Dominic Cummings to stay in post and for the public to have confidence in the advice that they're given. The Prime Minister in the end is going to have to choose. I think if he can't answer those questions today, he's appearing in front of a very important committee of MPs, the liaison committee, who are senior backbench MPs who chair select committees. He will be asked questions about this, and he needs to show that he has real answers to those questions. If he can't, then he really does need to reflect on the fact that the public are losing confidence in this strategy.
What about those who say that Labour MPs have also broken the rules? OK, they're not making the rules and they're helping towards in government, as Dominic Cummings has, but Stephen Kinnock visiting his parents outside in their garden and filming it. Another MP who attended a funeral where 100 people were at a funeral, that was not allowed. What about the reaction to those MPs? Were they wrong as well?
I think they were wrong. I mean, they got it wrong, and they've both acknowledged that in the cases that you mentioned. I mean, in Stephen Kinnock's case, he thought that he was complying with the rules that had come in a couple of days earlier because he was outside on the drive at his parents' house socially distancing. But the police pointed out that that wasn't the case. He said, he acknowledged that. Nobody's saying that people can't make mistakes in any instance. What seems fairly difficult to accept for a lot of people, including my own family and lots of families that I represent, is the idea that the person who authored those rules could then repeatedly break them, and when challenged about it doesn't express any regret and refuses to apologise. I think for a lot of families who've made much bigger sacrifices, including having loved ones die in care homes without being able to say goodbye, that really is a slap in the face, particularly because the defence of that from Tory cabinet ministers was that he was putting his family first. That's what's really upset a lot of people who feel that they had to make very difficult decisions that were very, very hard for their family members to bear for the greater public good. And if it's one rule for government advisors and one rule for the rest of us, I think we'll see that public confidence breaking down very quickly. And if people don't follow the guidance, we could be in a very bad place very, very fast.
Okay, do you understand why a lot of people are calling this a witch hunt against a man who delivered Brexit, by many on the Remain side? Emily Thornberry, your predecessor as Shadow Foreign Secretary, tweeted yesterday, a couple of days ago, after there was some video footage of Dominic Cummings being heckled really quite aggressively and abusively by some neighbours and others in the street as he returned home to his home in Islington. And Emily Thornberry tweeted, "The people of Islington, South and Finsbury can always be relied on to say it as it is." This was seen as effectively condoning abusive behaviour towards a public figure. Do you think she should apologise for that tweet?
Well, I'm sure that she doesn't. The video that she posted had her constituents telling some quite heartbreaking stories, actually, about the sacrifices they've made, and they were clearly very, very angry and upset, and I understand why. But I think it is right to say that people's families are off limits. Dominic Cummings is a public figure. He can be held to account, but that was his family home where he lives, I think, with his wife and young child. And I think it's really important as a country that we don't descend into breaking apart at this very moment. That's why this issue about Cummings and whether he followed the guidance is so important.
But you're saying it's okay for her to tweet approvingly about people basically shouting at someone in the street and shouting, some of it was really quite aggressive stuff, someone putting V's up and the like. We're not condoning that, are we?
No, absolutely not. I mean,
but she appeared to be.
Well, she didn't say explicitly that she condones it.
So that's okay.
No, I just don't think we should be protesting outside people's houses, and I understand why people are upset, and I understand why they're angry. But actually, the key thing here is to get back public confidence, and that means that the Prime Minister needs to answer questions about Dominic Cummings' conduct, and if he can't answer those questions, then he needs to take action, because at the moment I think people are just getting more and more angry, and I do understand why, I completely do, but that is not going to get us anywhere as a country.
Okay, let's talk about something else in relation to your brief as Shadow Foreign Secretary, this prospect of people getting summer holidays this year. I think a lot of people are turning their focus to when we get out of lockdown, being able to escape to a beach in Spain or wherever. There's been talk about quarantine, some sort of air bridges to certain countries. We're told we're going to face quarantine going into any country in the EU, and then for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks when we come back again, making a holiday virtually impossible for most people. Should we be having quarantine for people who return here, and should we not do a deal with other countries which have either a lesser or a similar rate of COVID of infection so that people can actually go on a summer holiday?
Well, I think doing those deals is going to be pretty difficult because we were so slow to respond to the pandemic in this country. There are a number of countries, including Greece, that are saying that Britain has to have different arrangements. So I think that would be quite difficult for Britain. The government's announced 7 times different quarantine measures that it wants to put in place and then rode back on them within a few hours. And I'm not sure that long-term quarantine is sustainable. It's a huge ask for people to self-isolate for 2 weeks after they come back from overseas. It takes a big toll on the economy as well as on people's families. The real solution to this is test, track and trace. If you were testing people when they got off aeroplanes back into the country, or preferably before they got on those aeroplanes, to travel back to the country, then you wouldn't need the quarantine measures that the government's currently announced. So they're welcome as a stopgap measure in the absence of anything else, but it just highlights why it's so important that we get test, track and trace up and running.